The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Kensington Palace, as Princess Catherine stood by the large windows of their private quarters. Her fingers traced the cool glass while she watched the gardeners tend to the rose bushes below. Today was different from any other day in their royal lives. Today, Prince William would embark on a solo diplomatic mission to Australia that would keep them apart for 3 weeks. Catherine had always been the steady presence beside William, the calm in his storm of royal duties. But something about this departure felt heavier than usual. Perhaps it was the recent challenges they had faced together, or maybe it was the simple realization of how much they had grown to depend on each other's strength over the years. William entered the room quietly, his travel documents in hand. He had been awake since dawn, reviewing briefings and making final preparations. The Australian government had specifically requested his presence for a series of environmental summits, and as the heir to the throne, he couldn't decline such an important diplomatic opportunity. "The car will be here in 20 minutes, he said softly, setting his papers on the mahogany desk that had belonged to his grandmother. Catherine turned from the window, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, neither of them spoke about the official reasons for his trip or the important work he would be doing. Instead, they simply looked at each other, acknowledging the quiet sadness that came with separation. Their 3 children were still asleep in their rooms down the hall. George, Charlotte, and Louis had said their goodbyes to their father the night before, with promises of video calls and stories from his travels. But adult goodbyes were different, carrying weights that children couldn't yet understand. William walked over to where Catherine stood, his footsteps muffled by the Persian rug that covered the hardwood floor. He reached out and took her hands in his, feeling their familiar warmth. "I know this isn't ideal timing," he began, his voice carrying the weight of responsibility that had shaped so much of their lives together. Catherine shook her head gently. "The timing is never ideal for these things. But that's what we signed up for, isn't it?" They had indeed signed up for a life where duty often came before personal preference, where service to the crown meant sacrifices that ordinary couples never had to make. Yet in moments like these, they were just William and Catherine, a husband and wife facing a temporary separation. The palace around them was beginning to stir with the quiet efficiency of staff preparing for the day ahead. Somewhere, in the kitchens, breakfast was being prepared. In the security offices, final checks were being made on travel arrangements. The machinery of royal life continued its steady rhythm, indifferent to the personal moments unfolding in the private quarters. William's phone buzzed with a text from his private secretary, confirming that everything was ready for departure. He glanced at it briefly, then set it aside. These final minutes belonged to them, alone. Catherine straightened his tie with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this small ritual countless times before. Her fingers moved with careful precision, but William noticed the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her emotions. "Remember to eat properly," she said, focusing on the tie rather than meeting his eyes. "I know how you get when you're busy. You forget to take care of yourself." William smiled at her concern. The same concern she had shown him since their university days, when she would remind him to study for exams or get enough sleep before important presentations. Some things never changed, regardless of titles or responsibilities. "I promise to eat," he replied, catching her hands and stilling them against his chest. "And I promise to call every day, even if it's just for a few minutes between meetings." They had developed these small rituals of reassurance over the years, ways of staying connected across distances and time zones. Technology made it easier than it had been for previous generations of royals. But nothing could truly replace being in the same room, sharing the same space. The sound of a car engine in the courtyard below signaled that his departure time was approaching. Neither of them moved toward the window to look, preferring to stay in their bubble of privacy for just a little longer. "The children will miss their bedtime stories," Catherine said, thinking of how William had made it a tradition to read to them every night he was home, no matter how late his official duties ran. "I've already recorded a few," William admitted, pulling out his phone to show her. "George helped me choose which books to read. He said Louis would want the one about the brave knight, and Charlotte would prefer the one about the princess who saves the kingdom. Catherine's eyes softened at this revelation. Even in the midst of preparing for important diplomatic work, William had thought about these small but meaningful details of their family life. The knock on the door came precisely at the appointed time. William's private protection officer stood in the doorway, respectfully waiting for acknowledgement while maintaining the discreet distance that allowed the royal couple their privacy. "Ready when you are, sir," the officer said, simply. William nodded, but didn't immediately move toward the door. Instead, he turned back to Catherine, as if memorizing her face before leaving. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the auburn highlights in Catherine's hair, and William was struck by how beautiful she looked in this unguarded moment. Not the polished princess that the public saw at official engagements, but the woman who had stood by him through everything, who had chosen a life of service alongside him, despite all the challenges it brought. Catherine reached up and touched his cheek gently, her thumb brushing across the slight stubble he hadn't had time to shave. 3 weeks isn't so long, she said, though her voice suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as him. 21 days, William agreed, though the specific number somehow made it feel longer rather than shorter. They embraced then. Not with the formal restraint they showed in public, but with the genuine affection of two people who had built a life together, despite the extraordinary circumstances that surrounded them. Catherine breathed in the familiar scent of his cologne, the same one he had worn since their early days of marriage. William held her close, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing and the way she fit perfectly against his chest. These were the moments he would carry with him during the long days of official functions and diplomatic meetings that lay ahead. When they finally separated, both of them had tears in their eyes, though neither commented on it. There was no shame in their emotion, no need to apologize for feeling deeply about their separation. William picked up his travel bag, the same leather case he had used for official trips since becoming a senior member of the royal family. Catherine walked with him to the door, her hand resting lightly on his arm. In the hallway, members of William's staff waited respectfully at a distance. They had all witnessed countless royal departures over the years and understood the delicate balance between public duty and private emotion that defined the lives of the people they served. As they walked through the palace corridors toward the main entrance, Catherine and William didn't speak. The click of their footsteps on the marble floors seemed unnaturally loud in the early morning quiet. The main entrance doors were already open, revealing the waiting cars and the small group of staff who would accompany William on his journey. The Australian High Commissioner's representative was there as well, ready to brief the prince during the drive to the airport. But for now, all of that official business waited. This moment belonged to a husband and wife saying goodbye, and everyone present understood the significance of allowing them that space. The morning air outside Kensington Palace carried the crisp promise of autumn as Prince William and Princess Catherine stepped through the main entrance. Together, the waiting convoy of black vehicles stood ready, their engines running quietly, while security personnel made final checks. This was the machinery of royal life in motion, efficient and discreet. Yet somehow it felt intrusive in this moment of personal farewell. Catherine had chosen to wear a simple navy dress with a cream-colored coat, clothes that made her feel confident without being showy. She knew that photographers might be positioned at a respectful distance, ready to capture images of the prince's departure. Even their private moments had a way of becoming public memories. William's staff maintained their professional distance, understanding that these final minutes belonged to the royal couple alone. The private secretary checked his watch discreetly, while the protection officers scanned the surrounding area with practiced efficiency. Everything was proceeding according to schedule, yet time seemed to move differently in these precious moments before departure. The head gardener, an elderly man who had worked on the palace grounds for over 30 years, paused in his work among the flower beds to offer a respectful nod to the departing prince. William acknowledged him with a warm smile, the same genuine expression he had shown since childhood to the staff who made the palace a home rather than just a grand building. Catherine noticed how William's shoulders seemed to carry invisible weight as they approached the cars. She knew him well enough to recognize when he was transitioning from husband and father into his role as a senior royal. preparing mentally for the responsibilities that awaited him on the other side of the world. "Promise me you'll take some time for yourself," she said quietly as they walked. "I know how packed your schedule will be, but try to find moments to breathe." William squeezed her hand gently. "I'll try to see some of the places we visited together during our tour," he replied, referring to their joint visit to Australia years earlier when they were newlyweds. "It might help me feel less far away." The memory of that trip brought a small smile to Catherine's face. They had been so young then, still learning how to balance their private relationship with their public duties. Now, years later, they had found their rhythm, but separation never became easier. As they reached the first car in the convoy, William's personal protection officer stepped forward to open the door. The interior was fitted with communication equipment that would keep the prince connected to London throughout his journey to the airport and beyond. But William didn't immediately get into the car. Instead, he turned to face Catherine fully, as if trying to imprint this moment in his memory. The morning sun cast a gentle light on her face, highlighting the small lines around her eyes that spoke of years of genuine laughter shared between them. "I love you," he said simply, words that carried the weight of everything they couldn't say in the presence of others. "I love you too," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite the emotion she felt. "Come home safely." They embraced once more, this time knowing it was truly their final moment together before his departure. Catherine felt William's arms tighten around her slightly, as if he was reluctant to let go. She memorized the feeling of his embrace, the warmth of his body against hers, the familiar scent that was uniquely his. When they separated, Catherine noticed that William's eyes had become bright with unshed tears. In all their years together, she had learned to read the subtle signs of his emotions. The way his jaw tightened when he was trying to maintain composure, the slight tremor in his voice when he was moved. William climbed into the car, settling into the leather seat while his protection officer secured the door. Through the tinted window, Catherine could see his silhouette as he arranged his papers and began the mental transition into his official role. The convoy began to move slowly through the palace gates, and Catherine walked alongside the car for a few steps, her hand pressed against the window. William placed his palm against the glass from the inside, creating a connection across the barrier that separated them. As the cars pulled away, gaining speed as they headed toward the main road, Catherine remained standing in the courtyard. She watched until the convoy disappeared around the corner, taking with it the man who was both a prince and her husband, both a future king and the father of her children. The palace staff who had witnessed the departure began to disperse quietly, returning to their duties with the understanding that the princess might need a few moments alone. The head housekeeper caught Catherine's eye and offered a knowing smile, a wordless gesture of support from one woman to another. Catherine made her way back into the palace, her footsteps echoing in the grand entrance hall. The building felt different already, larger and quieter, without William's presence. She climbed the stairs to their private quarters, where evidence of his hasty departure remained scattered about. His coffee cup still sat on the bedside table, half empty and growing cold. A book he had been reading lay open on the bed, a bookmark, marking his place for when he would return to it, in 3 weeks' time. These small details of everyday life seemed poignant in his absence. From down the hall came the sound of children beginning to stir in their bedrooms. Soon, Charlotte would appear asking for her father, and Catherine would have to explain again that Daddy had gone to Australia for his important work. George would want to know if they could track the prince's flight on the computer, while little Louis might simply wonder when Papa would be home to play. Catherine moved to the window where she had stood earlier that morning, looking out over the gardens where life continued its normal rhythm. The gardeners were back at work among the roses, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of London traffic beginning to build as the city woke up. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and she smiled when she saw it was from William, sent from the car during his journey to the airport. "Already missing you?" it read, followed by a simple heart emoji. Even princes, it seemed, relied on modern technology to stay connected to the people they loved. Catherine typed back quickly, "Fly safely. The children and I will be here when you get back." She added her own heart emoji before sending the message, a small gesture that felt important in bridging the distance that was already growing between them. The next 3 weeks would be filled with their separate responsibilities. William would attend environmental summits, meet with government officials, and represent the Crown in important diplomatic functions. Catherine would continue her own charitable work, attend scheduled engagements, and maintain the stability of their family life in his absence. But for now, in the quiet of their private quarters, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of missing him. Tomorrow she would return to her public role, smiling for cameras and fulfilling her duties with grace and dedication. Today, she was simply a wife whose husband had traveled far from home. Outside, the morning was growing brighter, and somewhere high above the clouds, a plane was carrying Prince William toward his destination. The distance between them was measured not just in miles, but in time zones and responsibilities. In the space between their separate duties to the Crown and country. Yet Catherine knew that their connection transcended physical distance. They had built something strong enough to withstand the pressures of royal life, something that 3 weeks apart couldn't diminish. Still, knowing this didn't make the goodbye any easier or the separation any less real. She touched the window glass where her reflection looked back at her, and for a moment she could almost feel William's hand pressed against the other side, just as it had been through the car window moments before. The gesture connected her to him across whatever distance now separated them. A promise that some things remained constant, even when everything else was in motion. 3 weeks later, the same courtyard at Kensington Palace buzzed with quiet anticipation. Princess Catherine stood by the window in their private quarters, but this time, her expression carried excitement, rather than sadness. Prince William's return flight had landed at Heathrow an hour earlier, and the convoy was making its way through London traffic toward home. The children had been restless all morning, checking the clock repeatedly and asking when Daddy would arrive. George had calculated the driving time from the airport with mathematical precision, while Charlotte had changed outfits twice to look perfect for her father's homecoming. Little Louis simply ran through the halls, occasionally shouting, "Papa home soon," to anyone who would listen. Catherine had tried to maintain her usual routine, but found herself checking her phone every few minutes for updates from William's protection team. The official parts of his trip had concluded successfully, with environmental agreements signed and diplomatic relationships strengthened. But none of that mattered as much as simply having him home again. During the 3 weeks of separation, they had spoken every day as promised. Sometimes for just a few minutes between his official engagements, other times for longer conversations when time zones aligned favorably. William had sent photos from Sydney Harbour and Melbourne's botanical gardens, places that reminded him of their shared travels years earlier. Catherine had kept him updated on the children's activities, sharing videos of Louis's first attempts at riding his bicycle without training wheels and Charlotte's performance in her school's autumn concert. George had insisted on showing his father his latest art project through video chat, holding up drawings of the family that included a figure labeled Daddy in Australia, standing far apart from the others. But video calls, no matter how frequent, couldn't replace physical presence. They couldn't capture the warmth of an embrace or the comfort of falling asleep next to someone you loved. Technology bridged distances but couldn't eliminate them entirely. Now, as Catherine watched from the window, she could see palace staff making subtle preparations for the prince's return. The head gardener was making final adjustments to the flower beds, ensuring everything looked perfect. Security personnel were conducting their routine checks with perhaps a bit more attention to detail than usual. The sound of car engines in the distance made Catherine's heart rate increase slightly. She had been looking forward to this moment for weeks, planning how she would greet William, what she would say first, how they would reconnect after time apart. The children heard the cars before Catherine could call them, and suddenly the quiet palace erupted with the sound of running feet as George, Charlotte, and Louis raced toward the main entrance. Catherine followed at a more measured pace, smoothing her dress and checking her reflection in the hallway mirror as she walked. By the time she reached the entrance hall, the children were already pressed against the windows, trying to catch their first glimpse of their father's car. Their excitement was infectious, and Catherine found herself smiling more broadly than she had in weeks. The convoy pulled into the courtyard, with the same efficiency that had marked William's departure. But the atmosphere felt entirely different. Where there had been solemnity and reluctance 3 weeks earlier, now there was joy and anticipation. William's protection officer opened the car door, and the prince emerged, looking slightly tired from his long flight, but unmistakably happy to be home. He wore a casual shirt and jacket, having changed out of his formal travel clothes during the flight. His face lit up immediately when he saw his family waiting for him. The children burst through the entrance doors before Catherine could stop them, running toward their father with the unconstrained enthusiasm that only young children could manage. William dropped his travel bag and crouched down to catch them as they collided with him in a tangle of arms and excited voices. "Did you bring us presents?" Charlotte asked immediately, while George wanted to know if William had seen any kangaroos. Louis simply clung to his father's leg, as if afraid he might disappear again if not held tightly enough. William laughed, the sound carrying across the courtyard and reaching Catherine where she stood in the doorway. She had heard him laugh during their video calls over the past 3 weeks, but hearing it in person felt different, richer, and more real. "I may have found a few things in Australia that I thought you might like," William admitted, causing the children to cheer and dance around him excitedly. Catherine walked toward them slowly, savoring this moment of reunion. William looked up from the children, and their eyes met across the courtyard, just as they had 3 weeks earlier during their goodbye. But where that look had carried sadness and reluctance, this one carried joy and relief. William stood up, gently disentangling himself from the children, and walked toward Catherine. The distance between them seemed to shrink with each step, and then, suddenly, they were in each other's arms, holding each other tightly while the children cheered around them. "Welcome home," Catherine whispered against his ear, breathing in the familiar scent that no amount of distance could make her forget. "It's good to be home," William replied, his voice thick with emotion. They held each other for a long moment, aware that they were being watched by staff members who were trying to be discreet, but couldn't help smiling at the genuine happiness of the reunion. Even the most professional palace workers were moved by the obvious love between the royal couple. When they finally separated, William kept one arm around Catherine while he bent down to properly greet each of the children individually. He listened to George's detailed account of everything that had happened during his absence, admired Charlotte's new haircut, and swept Louis up into his arms when the little boy demanded to be carried. "Can we see the presents now?" Charlotte asked hopefully, tugging on William's jacket. After lunch, Catherine intervened gently. "Daddy needs time to settle in and rest from his long flight." William smiled gratefully at his wife, recognizing her effort to help him transition from the demands of travel back to the rhythm of family life. The children groaned dramatically but accepted the compromise, racing ahead into the palace to tell the staff that Papa was finally home. As they walked back into Kensington Palace together, William carrying Louis while Catherine walked beside them, everything felt right again. The building that had felt too large and too quiet during his absence now hummed with the energy of a complete family. "How did everything go?" Catherine asked, as they climbed the stairs to their private quarters. "Successfully, I think," William replied, shifting Louis to his other arm. "The environmental agreements are stronger than we hoped, and I think we made some good progress on the conservation initiatives. But I'll tell you all about it later. Right now, I just want to be home with my family." In their private sitting room, William finally set down his travel bag and collapsed into his favorite armchair with Louis still clinging to him. Charlotte and George settled on the rug at his feet, ready to hear stories about his adventures on the other side of the world. Catherine curled up in the chair across from him, simply watching as William reconnected with their children. She noticed new lines around his eyes that spoke of long days and diplomatic dinners, but also a satisfaction that came from work well done and duties fulfilled. "Tell us about the big spiders," George demanded, having researched Australian wildlife extensively during his father's absence. William launched into a story about visiting a wildlife sanctuary, describing enormous huntsman spiders with exaggerated gestures that made the children shriek with delighted horror. Catherine listened with half her attention, using the rest simply to enjoy the sound of her husband's voice filling their home again. As the afternoon wore on and the children were eventually called away for their lessons, William and Catherine finally found themselves alone together. The reunion excitement had settled into something calmer but no less meaningful. 3 weeks felt like 3 months, William said quietly, reaching for Catherine's hand. I know, she replied, intertwining their fingers. The house was too quiet without you. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, simply enjoying being in the same room again. Outside, the afternoon sun cast golden light through the windows, and the sounds of London carried on the autumn air. Everything was exactly as it had been before William left, except that now he was home again. And that made all the difference. The goodbye 3 weeks earlier had been a moment of pure emotion, captured by photographers and witnessed by staff, but ultimately belonging to them alone. Now this reunion was equally emotional, but private in a different way, marked by quiet contentment, rather than dramatic gestures. William pulled Catherine into his arms, and she settled against his chest, listening to his heartbeat and feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. They were both older now than when they had first fallen in love, changed by years of royal responsibility and family life, but their connection remained as strong as ever. I love you, William said softly, echoing the words he had spoken before leaving. Welcome home, Catherine replied, because sometimes the simplest words carried the deepest meaning.